It started with a laugh. Sharp, sudden, and louder than it should have been. It echoed across the polished marble walls of the auditorium at Ridgeview University, slicing through the hush of an afternoon keynote meant to celebrate diversity in education. Senator Elizabeth Warren stood at the podium, smiling tightly, the corners of her mouth twitching as if she knew she'd just said something that was about to go viral. "Now that," she chuckled, motioning casually toward the janitor who had just apologized for dropping a mop bucket near the side door, "is public education in action." The crowd laughed, some nervously, others openly. Phones came out, cameras clicked, but one person didn't laugh. Senator John Kennedy, seated near the back in the second row of the invited panelists, leaned forward slightly and blinked slowly, his fingers steepled against his lips. Something in his gaze shifted. Not anger, not outrage, but the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm you never saw coming. 30 seconds earlier, no one noticed the janitor. He had slipped in through the side to do his job. Manuel, in his late 50s, wearing faded blue coveralls and a baseball cap with an American flag patch stitched near the back, had bent down to pick up a caution sign when the bucket tipped, water sloshing quietly onto the tile. "I'm very sorry," he said, his accent heavy but respectful. He reached for a rag, his hands trembling slightly, before freezing as the laughter erupted. He stood still, holding the mop upright like a soldier at rest. He didn't speak again. And yet, somehow, in that moment, he was the most visible man in the room. Warren continued her speech, breezing past the moment like a practiced performer brushing off a heckler. Her cadence returned, confident and controlled. She talked about policy, about progress, about systems of access, but no one was really listening anymore. Attention had crept into the room like fog rolling in through an open window. All eyes had flickered, just for a second, toward Kennedy. He hadn't moved. He didn't need to. What happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted or staged. And it wasn't politics. It was something quieter, something far more dangerous to a room full of people used to applause and headlines. Kennedy stood up. No cue, no microphone announcement, no nod to the moderator. He simply rose to his feet and began walking slowly toward the front, his boots clicking softly against the tile. The laughter had stopped long ago, but now it was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the space. The kind of silence you don't hear in Washington, the kind that makes your chest tighten before you know why. He reached the edge of the stage, then stopped. He didn't look at Warren. He looked at the crowd. Then he looked at Manuel, who was standing awkwardly off to the side, pretending to adjust a supply cart. Kennedy's voice came low, calm, and without a hint of anger. "Let me ask you something," he said. "Did you laugh because he mispronounced a word? Or because you think people like him don't deserve a voice? The words didn't land like a punch. They landed like an X-ray. There were no gasps, no outcries, just the kind of stillness that meant everyone had heard him, and no one could say a thing. In that moment, time didn't stop. It cracked. And through that crack poured every uncomfortable truth we try to silence with polite clapping and safe speeches. Kennedy didn't follow up. He didn't need to. The question hung in the air like smoke, curling into every corner of the auditorium, and the only sound that followed was the faint click of a phone being turned off by someone in the back who had just realized this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about dignity, real dignity. If you've ever heard a laugh that didn't feel like it belonged, a joke that cut too deep, a moment that wasn't meant for entertainment, now's the time to speak. Hit that like button if you believe respect shouldn't come with a resume, and drop a 9 in the comments if you've ever seen someone treated like they didn't matter just because of the way they speak. Because this story isn't just about a senator or a janitor. It's about all of us, and what we choose to stand for when nobody else does. Flashback to 30 minutes earlier. The auditorium hadn't yet filled, but the energy was already charged. Students, faculty, and local guests trickled into rows of curved oak chairs, greeted by printed programs that read, "Bridging Voices, Inclusion in Modern Education." The title felt hopeful, almost poetic. Elizabeth Warren, the headliner, had arrived early, surrounded by 2 aides and a university vice-chancellor. Her red blazer stood out like a flame at the edge of the stage, and she held a stack of carefully prepared note cards, color-coded by topic. She was smiling, at ease, nodding to familiar faces in the front row as she adjusted the microphone. No one could have guessed that she was about to derail her own message with a single sentence. The speech started with purpose. Warren spoke about growing up with limited means, about the power of education to uplift marginalized voices. She painted vivid pictures of underfunded schools, of hungry kids walking miles just to attend class. Her tone was heartfelt. For the first few minutes, even Kennedy seemed to listen with a kind of polite detachment. She had the room. She had the language. But then something shifted. As she drifted from policy into anecdote, her voice took on a different rhythm. Lighter, a little smug. She referenced a trip to a rural school district in Arkansas, chuckling at a conversation with a young boy who pronounced principal as principal. The crowd laughed, a few students clapped. She waved it off playfully, saying, "He'll get there." We all start somewhere. Kennedy blinked slowly. That blink would become important later. Then came the joke. The janitor, Manuel, entered discreetly from the far side, wheeling a cleaning cart with 2 mop buckets, one nearly full. He hadn't meant to interrupt, but the moment the water spilled, everything stopped. A crash of plastic, the sound of a mop clattering, the squeak of shoes shifting as heads turned, and then her words that would echo across the internet before sunset. "Now that," she said, pointing loosely towards the spill, "is public education in action." A half-second passed. Then the laughter, nervous at first, then bolder, applause even, people looking at each other like, did she just say that? But laughing anyway. That's what people do when they don't know how to react. They follow the loudest response in the room. Manuel froze mid-motion, crouched beside his cart. His hands, which moments ago were wiping water, now held nothing. His shoulders tensed. His gaze dropped. He didn't speak, but his silence was deafening. He stood and wheeled the cart backward, as if hoping to vanish into the wall. He didn't. Kennedy didn't move yet, not physically, but inside something set. His jaw locked just slightly, his fingers tapped once on his knee. This wasn't just about a joke. It wasn't about politics or policy. It was about power. Who holds the mic? Who holds the mop? And how easy it is to forget which voice matters more when no one's watching. What most of the room missed was what came next. A student in the second row, an education major, glanced over at her phone and quietly started filming. Not the spill, not the joke, but Kennedy's reaction. The lack of it. The stillness. His eyes never left the janitor. That video, all 30 silent seconds of it, would be posted to TikTok with a caption that simply read, "Watch who listens when everyone else laughs." It hit 500,000 views before the evening news even mentioned the event. And just as Warren began to pivot back to her scripted points, statistics about funding gaps, state-by-state testing numbers, graduation rates in underserved districts, no one was really listening anymore. Not fully. Something had broken the flow, cracked the surface, and no amount of policy language could seal it again. Kennedy was still seated, still silent. But the camera phones had started to turn toward him now. A few staffers in the corner exchanged glances. Even the vice-chancellor, seated beside the dean, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You could feel it. A storm wasn't coming. It had already arrived. They just didn't know it yet. And outside the building, in a quiet hallway, where faculty banners hung from vaulted ceilings, Manuel stood alone near a window, looking down at the grass below. A student approached him softly, handed him a bottle of water, and said, "You didn't deserve that, sir." He nodded once, then looked away. Back inside, Senator Kennedy finally rose from his seat. Not dramatically, not angrily, just slowly, with the precision of a man who didn't need volume to command the room. And as the auditorium tilted toward him, unknowingly, unwittingly, waiting for what would come next, the entire energy shifted. But no one, not even Warren, was ready for the question he was about to ask. Senator Kennedy didn't ask for the microphone. He didn't need to. The room fell into a hush so complete, it made the hum of the ceiling lights suddenly feel too loud. He stood there, one hand resting lightly on the edge of a wooden table near the front row, the other holding nothing. No paper, no prepared statement. He wasn't reading from a script. He was reading the room. Elizabeth Warren turned slightly, caught off guard, her fingers still hovering near the water glass she had just picked up. She opened her mouth, perhaps to offer a segue or a defense, but no words came out. She had been the one holding the floor just moments ago. Now she was only holding breath. Kennedy tilted his head slightly, not at her, but toward the audience, and then toward the janitor, Manuel, who had paused again, mop in hand, by the exit door. There was a beat. Then Kennedy spoke. "I've heard a lot of speeches about inclusion," he said, his voice low, steady, wrapped in that unmistakable Louisiana drawl that somehow made every word feel like it had already survived a storm. "A lot of words about giving people a voice. But if we only listen to the ones who speak like us, walk like us, or dress like us, that ain't inclusion. That's a mirror." The room was still. A few heads nodded slowly. Several students lowered their phones, no longer recording out of curiosity, but out of respect. Kennedy continued, his voice gaining quiet gravity. "I want to ask just one thing. Not to Senator Warren, not to this university, but to everyone sitting in this room." He turned and looked straight into the audience now. "When he dropped that mop, and she made that joke, did you laugh because he mispronounced a word, or because deep down you think he doesn't belong here?" That question didn't land like a debate point. It landed like a diagnosis, as if he'd held up an X-ray and let everyone see their own ribs shaking inside. A whisper fluttered through the room. Someone shifted in their seat. Another person exhaled sharply. Warren's smile had vanished. Her face tightened, not in anger, but in realization. Kennedy wasn't attacking her. He was exposing something she hadn't even seen herself. Not the moment she mocked. The instinct behind it. He looked down for a moment, gathering himself, then lifted his eyes again. "You want to know what makes a community?" he said. "It's not how many degrees are hanging on the wall. It's how we treat the people who clean under those walls when no one else is watching." A slow, steady applause started. Not thunderous, not dramatic, just real, organic. A student from the third row stood up, then someone else. Kennedy didn't nod. He didn't smile. He didn't even acknowledge it. He just looked over at Manuel, still by the door, and said quietly, "Sir, I hope you know. You're seen." Manuel looked stunned. His mouth opened slightly. He nodded once, barely, then blinked hard as if trying to keep something inside. The janitor became the most important man in the room, and he hadn't said a word. But Kennedy wasn't done. He turned back toward Warren now. Not confrontationally, but deliberately. "Senator," he said, I don't believe you meant harm." "I truly don't. But intent isn't what defines a moment. It's impact." Warren, still frozen at the podium, managed a shallow breath. She nodded faintly, but said nothing. The crowd wasn't looking at her anymore. The spotlight had shifted, not just physically, but morally. Then came the moment that would be replayed on every news segment, TikTok, and reaction channel for the next week. Kennedy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not an attack file, not a scandal sheet, just a handwritten quote. He unfolded it and read, voice calm. "Respect means listening hardest to the person you assume knows the least." He paused, folded the paper again, and set it gently on the podium. "Let's start there." That was it. No shouting, no finger-pointing, no slogans, just a question, a truth, and a mirror held up to a room that didn't realize it had forgotten how to see. If you've made it this far, ask yourself, have you ever mistaken silence for lack of worth? Have you ever laughed along just because everyone else did? If so, now's your time to speak up differently. Tap the like button if you believe quiet dignity matters more than loud credentials. And if you've ever been the one overlooked, drop a 9 in the comments. We see you now. The silence didn't end with Kennedy's last sentence. It lingered, heavy and human, folding itself into every breath inside that auditorium. For a moment, no one knew what to do. Elizabeth Warren stepped back from the podium, her hand still hovering above her note cards, but she didn't reach for them. She glanced at the folded paper Kennedy had left behind. Just a slip of handwriting, unassuming in size, but now monstrous in weight. She didn't touch it. No one did. It was a sophomore student who broke the silence first, not with words but with movement. She stood slowly from her seat in the 6th row, turned her phone toward herself, and whispered into the camera. He didn't need a mic drop. He dropped the truth. She posted it to TikTok with a simple caption. "This is the moment everything shifted." It went live at 2:41 p.m. By 3:26, it had 300,000 views. By 4:15, news outlets were clipping Kennedy's question, reacting in disbelief not at what he said, but how he said it. Reddit threads began filling with analysis. The top-voted comment read, "That wasn't politics. That was a moral masterclass." Twitter reposted the folded paper image, the quote written in all caps, "Respect means listening hardest to the person you assume knows the least." It trended under #, Janitor moment, and in the middle of it all, students began resharing the janitor's name, Manuel Alvarez. By that evening, Manuel was no longer just a background figure in a suit of coveralls. His story began to emerge piece by piece. A user on LinkedIn claimed to have worked with him at a local literacy program for adult immigrants. Another posted an image from a community event, Manuel speaking to a crowd in Spanish, leading a workshop on financial literacy. Someone even found an old newspaper article that quoted him after volunteering at a hurricane relief shelter in 2017. Turns out Manuel wasn't just a janitor. He was a father, a former teacher, a man who had lost his accreditation when fleeing political violence in his home country. And yet, every day, he showed up to clean a university filled with people who never looked twice. And suddenly, people were looking. The university's student-run newspaper released a breaking editorial before dinner. We laughed. He listened. Then Kennedy spoke. It ended with the line, "Education is not just in the lecture halls. Sometimes it pushes a mop." Warren's team released a short press statement just after 6 p.m. It was careful. Too careful. Senator Warren values all workers and deeply regrets if any words were misunderstood. But it wasn't enough. Not because the words were wrong, but because the moment had already moved past damage control. This wasn't about offense. It was about reflection. And Warren, once considered one of the most polished speakers in modern politics, suddenly seemed tone-deaf, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't say when it counted. Meanwhile, Kennedy said nothing further. He declined interviews, walked straight to his car with one aide, and didn't post a single word online. But his question had already left his hands. Now it belonged to the public. In classrooms that week, professors shifted their lesson plans. A communications class played the video on mute and asked students to observe body language. A sociology professor rewrote a prompt for midterms. Describe a moment where silence spoke louder than authority. A high school English teacher in Des Moines played the clip and asked his students, who was the real educator in this story? But it was Manuel who gave the most unexpected lesson. 3 days later, the university invited him to speak, not on a stage, not for a speech, but at a student-led discussion circle about dignity in education. He arrived wearing the same coveralls, freshly ironed, and when handed a mic, he hesitated. Then he said quietly, "I clean the floor, yes, but I also see the footprints left behind, and some of them say more than words ever could." The room applauded, not because he demanded it, but because he didn't. His words were clipped, shared again, translated into Spanish, set to piano music and posted to Reels. Even celebrities reposted it, with captions like, "Real strength doesn't need a podium." By the end of the week, the university offered Manuel a paid position as a mentor in its adult ESL program. He accepted, not for the money, but because, in his words, people only learn when they're willing to feel small enough to listen. And in the background, the image of Senator Kennedy placing the folded paper on the podium became the symbol of something bigger. Not outrage, not judgment, but a shift. A cultural moment where power was measured not in applause, but in the ability to ask the right question and walk away. Sometimes all it takes to change a conversation is one person willing to stop the noise. And sometimes that person isn't the one with the microphone, it's the one with the mop. Are you still watching? Good. Because now it's your turn. Have you ever looked down on someone without meaning to? Have you ever needed someone to remind you what respect really sounds like? Tap like if this story opened something in you, and if you believe real change starts with the quiet moments, drop a 9 below. Let the world know you're listening now. 3 days later, the cameras returned. But this time, they weren't there for a senator. They were waiting for an apology. Word had spread that Elizabeth Warren would be making a public statement from the same stage, same auditorium, same microphone where the moment had begun. The chairs were rearranged, lighting softened, and her podium now bore a small sign that read, Community Forum on Inclusion and Growth. But everyone knew what it really was. A reckoning. Warren stepped onto the stage wearing a muted gray suit, her usual energy dimmed beneath the weight of public expectation. She carried no notes this time. Just a small bottle of water and the cautious poise of someone rehearsing every breath. The auditorium was half full, but packed with pressure. Students, faculty, media. The same janitor's cart sat quietly behind the exit door, unmanned but unmistakable. She began slowly. Her voice was measured. "The last few days have taught me a lot," she said. "Not just about perception, but about impact, about how words, even those said in jest, can carry more than we realize." The words were right, but the moment was already gone. No one booed, no one cheered, a few polite nods, a few scribbles from journalists. But as she continued to speak, about intentions, misinterpretations, her background in education, the silence in the room didn't soften. It calcified. Because here's the truth about a public apology. It only lands if it follows real humility, not just timing. Warren closed her speech with, I will keep listening, and I will do better." Then she stepped away, head slightly bowed. The applause was brief, sparse, and as she exited stage left, her aide touched her arm gently, whispering something. She didn't look back. But what happened next? No one scripted. Manuel entered the room, not as a symbol, but as himself. Dressed again in his navy coveralls, he quietly took a seat in the back row. No one announced him. No spotlight followed. But students turned. A hush rippled across the space. And that's when a young woman, the same one who had filmed Kennedy days before, raised her hand and asked the moderator, "Can we hear from Mr. Alvarez?" Gasps. Then stillness. The moderator froze, unsure, then nodded. "If Mr. Alvarez is comfortable, we'd welcome his thoughts." Manuel stood slowly. He didn't walk to the stage. He just spoke from where he was. "I never asked for anyone to speak for me," he began, "and I didn't expect anyone would care about my voice. But when Senator Kennedy said I was seen, I realized I had stayed quiet for too long." He paused, breathing in the still air. "I came to this country because I believed in what it said on paper: respect, dignity, freedom. Not just in courtrooms or classrooms, but in how we look at each other in moments that seem small." The entire auditorium leaned in. People think the hardest part of being invisible is being ignored. But no, it's when you finally speak, and they still only see your uniform. There were no cameras clicking. Not yet. Everyone was too still. "I don't blame the senator," he said gently, referring to Warren. "But I do hope this place, this room, these students, learn something that can't be taught in lectures." He looked toward the back door, his voice soft. "Dignity isn't something you give. It's something you recognize." And with that, he sat down. No mic drop, no hashtags, just truth. Then something beautiful happened. A group of students stood, one by one, not in protest, in quiet solidarity. One student in a wheelchair raised her hand and said, "Thank you, Mr. Alvarez." Another, a first-generation college attendee, added, "You taught us more in 5 minutes than most courses teach in 5 weeks." The moderator, clearly shaken, closed the session early. Not from discomfort, but from the sense that something had concluded itself. Something deeper than discussion. Something sacred. Outside the auditorium, the press gathered quickly, hoping for quotes. They got none. Warren left through a side door, escorted silently. Kennedy never showed. He didn't need to. But that night, on every campus forum and podcast, the story evolved again. Not about scandal, not even about redemption, but about the silence that follows clarity. A journalist from NPR wrote, "Senator Kennedy's question didn't end the conversation. It created space for a voice we hadn't heard. And that voice turned out to be the most necessary of all." On Instagram, someone posted a photo of Manuel seated in the back row, captioned, "He didn't need a stage. He already had the floor." The image went viral. Again. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. By Friday, professors were revising syllabi to include a new discussion unit titled "The Ethics of Voice: Who Speaks, Who Listens, Who Laughs." High school classrooms across the country were printing out the quote Kennedy had written and leaving it on whiteboards. Respect means listening hardest to the person you assume knows the least. And still, Kennedy remained silent. Not out of pride, but because his work was already done. Sometimes the strongest words are the ones that echo even after the microphone is turned off. If this moment struck something in you, if you believe respect is more than words, more than a gesture, then let others know. Click like and comment 9 if you believe listening is more powerful than speaking. This isn't just a story, it's a turning point. And you're a part of it now. By the time Monday rolled around, something had changed. Not in the headlines, but in the undercurrent. The story had outgrown the people in it. It no longer belonged to Warren or Kennedy or even Manuel. It had become a mirror, passed hand to hand across campuses, classrooms, break rooms, church basements, and kitchen tables. People weren't just talking about what was said, they were asking what it meant, and perhaps more importantly, what it revealed about all of us. The clip of Kennedy's question had now reached over 50 million views across platforms. But what made it different wasn't the scale. It was the tone. It wasn't driven by rage or sarcasm. There were no screaming matches, no pundits calling for resignations. It was the stillness that traveled. The way a single question, asked calmly, could stop a story and start a reflection. In New York, a subway conductor printed Kennedy's quote and taped it above the intercom in his train cab. In Texas, a barista added it to a chalkboard where they normally wrote drink specials. In a fifth-grade classroom in Oregon, a teacher wrote it on the board and asked her students to write stories about a time they felt overlooked. One child wrote, "When I wear my glasses, kids call me robot. But I can see better. That's not funny. That's power." Even late-night comedians approached the moment differently. One host said, "Senator Kennedy did something rare. He didn't cancel, he didn't clap back. He just opened the door and let truth walk in." Another joked, "Warren's speech had numbers. Kennedy had one sentence. Guess which one went viral?" But even in laughter, there was respect. And then came the unexpected ripple. A university in the Midwest announced it was launching a new annual lecture series, not in Kennedy's name, nor Warren's, but in Manuel Alvarez's. The theme? Unheard Voices. The series would focus on people working in service roles across campuses, janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, giving them the platform to share their stories, experiences, and wisdom. Because education isn't just about who stands behind the podium, the university president said. It's about who cleans the floor beneath it. Manuel's response? "I'm honored, but I'm not a symbol. I'm just a man who wanted to do his job with dignity. If people learn from this, I hope they learn to pause before laughing and listen before labeling." Back at Ridgeview University, the auditorium was quiet again. The banners had been taken down. The stage was bare. But something remained. The folded piece of paper Kennedy had left behind, creased, scribbled in pen, worn at the corners, was framed behind glass at the student center with a small plaque beneath it. It didn't name the author. It didn't quote the question. It simply read, "Sometimes one sentence is enough." Warren remained largely silent in the weeks that followed. She returned to policy work, showed up to committee meetings, gave speeches at other universities. But something was different. Her tone was gentler, her phrasing more careful. She never referenced the moment directly. But every time she spoke, you could hear a pause, just a beat longer than before, between thought and delivery. And that pause said everything. As for Kennedy, he never followed up. He never tweeted, never gave an interview. When asked by a reporter months later if he'd planned the moment, he smiled slightly and said, "I didn't plan anything. I just didn't like the way silence felt that day." That line, too, found its way into 1,000 reposts, printed on shirts, stickers, bookmarks, not because it was catchy, but because it was honest. And maybe that's the real story, that in an age of noise, spin, and instant outrage, one man paused. One man asked, one man listened, and the world followed. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't. So now, the question turns to you. Have you ever been the one who needed someone to speak up, not with anger, but with clarity? Have you ever laughed without thinking, and wished you hadn't? Have you ever stayed silent when your voice could have opened a door? If this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Share it. Let someone else see what happens when questions are asked with grace and answers come in the form of reflection. And if you've ever believed that dignity is not earned through titles, but through how we treat one another, hit that like button. Drop a 9 in the comments. And the next time the room goes quiet, maybe, just maybe, you'll be the one who stands